All right, so back to CMP 100. Let's take a look at what is happening in the 90s as we move from the 80s to the 90s. Now, what I want to focus you on at this point is really realizing that these theories hold value and truth in them, right? These theories are basically just, hey, we look at society and we see these patterns, and so we think this is what's going on, right? A theory is not a law, and it's very hard to have social laws, right? I don't mean like laws that control us, but to have something move from a theory to a law, it always happens this way because people are pretty complex. So if I was to ask you, take a look at the chart on the screen, who was buying computers in the 70s, the late 70s, right? So you're dealing with really around 77, 78, people start buying. And then the early 80s, who would those people be according to this chart that's on the screen? Hopefully you answered early adopters. And there's one that I did not put in this chart. I mentioned it up here, right? There's the early majority. Here's the early adopters. Here's the innovators. They're only 2.5% of the populace. So in the early 70s, right, that would have been these people. They have the ability to have a better understanding of what's happening with whatever that technology is, and they got the money to spend. But most of the people in the 70s and 80s would have been early adopters. Now, we also talked about the fact that the IBM computer is coming into the fray where we get the term PC from, and that this IBM PC kind of takes over much of what's happening. So we're going to look at how that process of what happened with IBM and what happened in businesses affected who was adopting these computers and moving forward with them, and also how that affected the purchasing. Now, the reason that I'm going into this is I'm building some information about Microsoft and Apple, and because those are the two big tech companies and IBM that were around then, and they're also around now. And so we can kind of look at their lifespan much better. You know, we can't do this with Google currently because Google hasn't been as around as much. And we can't really do that with Facebook because they have been around even less time. But we can take the things that we look at with Microsoft and Apple and IBM, and we can watch what happens with these other companies like Amazon and see what happens. And I'm telling you, these companies are doing the same thing because they don't want to become the next IBM or really even the next Microsoft because they've fumbled the ball in a lot of ways. So let me jump over to my other screen that I've got here. And let's take a look at this little history too. This is the second writing that I have. Basically took the thing that I wrote up for this class about the history of computers and split it into two. And so this is the larger portion. It takes place basically picking up in the 80s, going through the 90s, taking a look at things that happened that faltered. And as I said in class, so one of the things I mentioned in class was that sure, you're not going to be in charge of a big company, right? You're well, maybe you will be. If you do, you know, look me up, take me out to lunch or something, buy me a car. Anyway, um, you're probably not going to be in charge of a large company and need to know these things in that broad of a sense. But there's technology that comes out, and I use the example of virtualization. Virtualization on servers, for servers, is pretty much the standard today. Virtualization's been around for a very long time. I encourage you to take CMP 255. That's the class that's pretty much all lab and very, very laid back, but very informative about what is virtualization and how do we use it on servers. You get to do all that stuff in there. You know, it's been around since the 50s, but once the processing power got to where it needed to be, then it really had an impact. If you were working for an organization 15, 20 years ago, virtualization was just on the cusp of really becoming something. However, as I said, it was around for a very long time. If you jumped in at that time and started using virtualization, it was very expensive, very problematic. It took it many years to get to where it is now, and that's the thing. We always say that about technology. Oh, well, it's immature. It's not. We haven't got past the problems yet, but you never know how quickly it will overcome those problems. How quickly people will push it forward through discoveries. And so you really have to have this understanding of, okay, well, when do I need to watch the technology, and then when do I need to act? Because if you act too soon, then the company is largely, hopefully someday you'll be in this situation, they're largely going to remember that you spent millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars, or if it's a small organization, still tens of thousands of dollars on something that wasn't ready, and that you wasted all this money. And that decreases their trust in you. If you did it at the right time, you saved a bunch of money. If you did it too late, which a lot of companies are doing now, there's all sorts of benefits that you've missed out on in the past 7 years. And so hopefully many of you will move beyond I'm tech support, and really move into influencing wherever you work. And it's important not to just read some blog and go, all right, now's the time, and go out and do it, because that can damage what they see you doing. That's something, thankfully, I kind of knew and understood. But even then, I was usually pushing it too fast, right? I was like, oh, let's do this, because I'm so excited to do it, when I really should have been waiting a couple more years on a lot of it. So in any case, the frustrations with early PCs. This little section describes what were the problems. So we have these great innovative machines here in the 70s, 80s, and it's just fantastic that now you could do word processing, you could do spreadsheets, you could do anything, right? And a big thing for a lot of people, especially smaller and medium businesses, remember who are the ones really, getting this going, right? It's these early adopters, these innovators, these people that go, I can use that. Well, those are normally in small businesses, medium businesses, home situations, education, because that's where their influence is felt the most, right? So you would have had at the time a lot of smaller businesses get a computer so that they can store their customer database on it, right? You couldn't do that before. You would have to go over to the filing cabinet and look up past orders. How many times did so and so order this? Oh, it was a pain. It was a chore. It would take you hours to figure out what computers figure out in a couple of seconds if you put in the information, right? So those were the kinds of people that were, buying the computers at the time. There was some problems with them though, and compatibility was a huge issue. So if you went out and you bought yourself a Tandy, a Trash 80, TSR 80, and you were using that in your business, and then you're looking at what's coming out and you're like, wow, that Commodore 64 is a lot better. Well, whatever software you bought for your TSR 80 is not going to run on the Commodore 64. So now you got to go buy new software. And software was expensive. So you're paying a lot of money for the computer, and then you're also paying a lot of money for the software, and that software is really non-transferable, right? Right now, you can go get Office 365 as a student, and again, hopefully here at EA we'll have that set up so you can get it, next semester or next fall. But I can get Office 365, and I can get it, and the apps run on, Android, iOS, right, and then the actual real full stuff works on Mac and Windows. And I just get that product and I put it where I want. That's a topic known as interoperability. It means that things can they can interoperate with one another. Yeah, it's one of those terms that we tend to only use in technology. But why that's such a big deal is because it gives us freedom, right? We can do whatever we want. Well, the internet is what really pushed that. The internet forced companies like Microsoft and Google and all these bigger companies to be compatible with one another. Back in the 90s, I remember that we switched from which would be Novell Office these days, but it's been beyond that. It's Corel Office now. It's been sold over and over again, but it would have been WordPerfect. Lots of people got onto the WordPerfect bandwagon, and so by the 90s, they're still using WordPerfect, but Word had come out, and Word was very competitive. It had a lot of good stuff in it. And there's a story there about how Microsoft got that done, not illegally, but a little unethically. But in any case, and we switched from WordPerfect to Word. And why we switched is because the feds were all using Word. I worked for the local government, right? So the feds are all using Word, and the state's using Word, right? The county's using Word. So we as a city, we started using Word because there's always these incompatibility issues. You could save it as a Word file or some compatible format, and PDFs were around, but this kind of sharing was, hey, let me send you that file. You type in what you need, right? You go ahead and modify what you need, send it back to me, that kind of thing. And so we needed the interoperability. We needed the compatibility that would provide, because even within our own Windows systems, right, that different piece of software was not compatible with the other software. Take that to the Macs in the 70s and 80s. The Apple Mac wasn't compatible with the Apple II. Commodore 64 wasn't compatible with the PET. The Atari 800 wasn't compatible with the Atari 400, right? Even later IBM compatibles were not compatible with the first PCs. There was all these issues. Now, part of that is just because it's all growing fast, right? It's like, oh, we need new features and we can do this now, and we couldn't do that 5 years ago. And so you're maximizing the potential in your hardware, but at the same time, you're not providing any compatibility. And there was definitely ways to do it. They could have done it. But again, you've got the business aspect of things where people want to make money. And if I'm going to make my system compatible with my older system, then that's just going to cost me money. They wanted to sell stuff. And so if you went out and bought a bunch of stuff that worked on your Apple II, and now Apple Mac is released, so the Macintosh computer is released, they would love for you to buy all new software, right? They don't really want you to use the old stuff. That's a business, right? Where you just say, yeah, we got a couple $100 out of them 5 years ago. We need a couple $100 more out of them now, right? That's the deal. And so that's actually one of the bad things that I give an example of that Apple did. And I can't remember if I talked about this. So if I did, just fast forward a little. The biggest mistake Apple made is, you have to remember, Wozniak and Jobs are like 22 years old. So they're younger than most of you, or at least your same age. And they're running a multi-million-dollar company that's shipping things worldwide, right? Kind of a big deal. Well, once, as it mentions down here later, as we take a look at GUIs, let that load while I'm talking. Once the GUI operating system was kind of exposed and like, hey, this is the direction we need to go, the graphical user interface. This is a section where we talk about it over at Xerox PARC. So actually, let me just mention this story, and then we'll kind of integrate it with everything else. So, Doug Engelbert, which we had already talked about, he kind of looked and said, hey, we can have a graphical system and you can use a mouse to move things around and click on stuff. And he introduced a whole bunch of things, but people like Steve Jobs didn't know that. I'm sure that Bill Gates did, because he was in school. So Steve Jobs, he didn't go to college. He just started and then decided not to. So over at Xerox, they had pioneered this graphical user interface and really making it what it is. And that's a picture of it here on the screen. And it really, if most people looked at that, they'd go, oh, well, that's a Mac. And it's like, no, it's actually a Xerox computer is what it is. But they really formulated everything and how it worked. Well, over here is what DOS looks like, right? The command line interface, where you have to type everything in, you have to know all the different stuff. We'll get to that. So he sees this graphical interface. Xerox even pioneered local networking, like what we do in our houses and schools and businesses. And Steve Jobs even mentioned that when he went over there to Xerox, and they basically, there was a smart person over there going, hey, nobody's using this, right? We as Xerox abandoned this, which we shouldn't have done. But maybe we can recoup some of our costs by licensing the technology, right? Somebody else can have a leg up, right? They don't have to develop it from scratch. They can actually start from this point, move forward, right? So Steve Jobs is invited over, and he gets to see this graphical system, and they show him connected computers and being able to print across the network and being able to email and all that different stuff. But he's not really paying attention to that because he's so enamored with this. He realizes that right now this is of course an IBM computer command line interface, but an Apple computer looked the same. An Apple II, it was a command line. Everything was command line back then. And so he knew this was the future. And the biggest mistake they made is that he's like, we need to know a whole new computer, right? The next computer that we build is going to be, an IBM killer. It's going to be everything that anybody ever wanted. That's kind of the way he's viewing it. And he didn't understand at the time, because again, this is a weird new technology. It would be like saying automobiles came out and Ford really popularized them. That would be IBM. And then Apple came out and the car was so much more powerful as to what you could do with it, but driving it was totally different, and it was really, really expensive. And expecting people to understand that the last car I bought from Apple did these things, and this one's so much better, but it's so much more expensive. But the things it does that are better are worth it. I want that. He didn't get that that's really what he was doing. What they should have done is what I'm getting to, is gradually move people forward, right? They had a huge Apple II base, right? You got all these people using Apple IIs. Well, just make them more powerful. There's a reason why that happens these days. So make them more powerful until they get powerful enough to run an interface like this. Then design the interface and have it going. If we look up, actually, let me pause this, and then I'll come back to it with the stuff pulled up. That way you don't have to watch me pull stuff up. So all right, I am back. So what you have here up on the screen is actually Microsoft Windows, which is an MS-DOS executive program. In other words, it's an executable program. And this is what it looked like in 1985. And, to give Microsoft credit, so this might look pretty lame. They really had to deal with some hardware limitations at the time. The focus in the business world was being able to run bigger databases, to do more calculations, to get all that stuff done, not to make it pretty. And so the graphics hardware was not in place to do that. And very few computers that were IBM's had that kind of power. And when they did, they were $5,000 computers. They were expensive. Now, if we take a look at, let me move my little window here. Stuff's always in the way. So we take a look at the Apple stuff that's going on at the time. And wait for my controls to move. This is what the Mac OS looked like. And so very, very much exactly like what Xerox had done. But of course, they had reinvented this, right? The Xerox machine was one of those big refrigerator type computers. This was a very tiny computer. So things had changed in the years that they did this. But okay, so we saw the Windows one, that was 1985. What you're looking at here was released in 1984. Now, Apple also released, because see, Apple II was the main bread and butter, right? The Apple II line of computers was massive. It's where basically almost all their money was coming from. This was the Apple II GS that was released in '86. So the GS graphic system, wow, looks a heck of a lot like the one that was released 2 years earlier. right? Now, this system is running on better hardware, more futuristic hardware that was going to last for the next 10 years and so on. But they didn't understand the business. Actually, I think Steve Wozniak understood better, because this was what you're looking at on the screen was Steve Jobs' baby. And what you're looking at on the screen here is Steve Wozniak's baby. And I think the Woz had a better idea, and a lot of people in the company had a better idea of, let's move our Apple II customers forward to the situation we need. Yes, it'll take us a couple of years longer to get it done, but we'll be able to promise them these upgrades. All their past software for the Apple II is going to work on this new system, and we'll be able to have people programming a whole different way, a new powerful system. So we'll be able to do both within this computer. And Steve Jobs didn't want to do that and really bet the farm on the Macintosh computer. And I know that the Macintosh computer has had great success, and it's had its day in the sun, we'll say that, and still continue to this day. It's a great system to use, but it almost killed them, and that's the point. How did it almost kill them? Well, because again, they split their development of what they were doing. They developed a brand new computer. That computer was $3,400. This one would have been half that price, right? Was the computer better? Sure it was. But just because you build a better computer doesn't mean people are going to buy it. Now I'm going to pull up one other thing and talk to you in the meantime. What happened to Commodore, right? Commodore had this huge, massive amount of people that were using their system. I mean, they really did. They had tons of people using their system. Well, they bought out a company that was called Amiga that had built a computer that was fully multitasking. The hardware was in line with what a Macintosh computer was, except it was actually better. I'm having a little slowdown on the internet today here for some reason. But it was actually the first computer that was fully multitasking, meaning that you could run two things at once without anybody conflicting with one another. It was fantastic. Anybody, I mean, the software conflicting with one another. Nobody else had that. That's the thing that you have to understand. This behind it was a guy named Jay Miner, and he had a development team that he was working with. And his idea was, if we can build a computer that can run games as well as a stand-up arcade system, right? Not the home system you're using, but what it's like in the arcade, the machine will be powerful enough to do anything that anybody wants it to do, right? It'll do everything. So this had incredible sound. It had incredible graphics. It had everything. I mean, it's just everything you could ever want. And the price was priced right in there where a Mac computer was, and right in there where an IBM computer was. But none of you know about this system. It's a very popular system, still has a huge fan base out there, but nowhere near, right? Nowhere near Windows, nowhere near Mac OS. And you know nothing about that system. The best doesn't always win, right? They make bad decisions in business. And mostly the reason why is because the people in business don't really understand what's going on. Steve Jobs basically was too young to really understand that he had an install base, and he was alienating that install base by doing something else, right? That he needed to bring those people forward. And it would probably be a very, very different story now. Compatibility was an issue. But I think we would have probably been able to push that compatibility forward quite a bit if the market was very much split, say like 70% Windows and 30%, Apple II, that kind of thing. Because people would have said, I need to be compatible with these, and they would have wanted that, and people would have made software for it. Instead, what ended up happening is that the IBM just won out. What was happening in the business world was that they didn't, right? Or like I said, you're talking about the business people up at top. They don't know what's going on with these computers. They are not who we think they are. right? They are late majority people, maybe early majority, but most in business are looking at what's being done with these computers and going, hey, this is kind of important. Now, I said small business, medium business, that's these early adopters, right? They get it. It's like, this can really help me. When you're sitting way up on top of a Fortune 500 company or Fortune 100 company, meaning you got hundreds of thousands of employees, you really don't know how that computer is going to affect things. And so they needed a name behind them that they trusted. And the name that all those businesses trusted was IBM. IBM made computers, and now they made a small one. And they knew that if they bought IBM, they wouldn't be abandoned, that IBM could show them the way, that IBM could make the software that they would need, because after all, they don't know what they need, right? They know, well, word processing's cool, but how about the database stuff? We do that on the mainframe. How can we, it was a confusing time for them. So once you hit that stage, all these early majority and late majority people now are being forced to use this technology in business, right? Early adopters, no problem. I can use a Commodore at home, and I can use an Apple at work, or I could use an Apple at home and an IBM at work. No big deal. Computer's a computer. It has file system. You save things on it. You run these programs. Doesn't matter if it's different. I can figure it out, right? That's the innovators and the early adopters. The early majorities and late majorities, no, that's not them. That is not them. It takes them longer to learn this stuff. So really, what pushed things forward in the industry, and it really did kind of bloat the industry a bit, is that people at work that really couldn't understand computers well now had to use them on a daily basis. And you're going to learn this. Some of you already know this. When you're working, you're expected to do your job when you're there. You're not expected to learn how to do your job when you're there. And so most of these individuals were getting a computer, the exact same kind, and having one at home, and they were spending their life savings, right? These were $3,500 worth of software and hardware so that they could actually do that job at home and do all the learning. So go home at 5, keep learning till 8, have a little time to eat, and relax, go to bed, and do the same thing the next day until you can get over that hump of, this is what a computer is and this is how I use it. And that's going to take them time because they're not really on the cusp of that, right? They're not the super smart ones that have no problem. Anyway, this section talks about what I already talked about, which was the fact that, there's these other computers, everybody was doing the graphical system, and not the best person always wins. And you're going to see that. You are a technologist, you're somebody that's a techie, and techies love shiny new things. I would buy tons of phones and notebooks and all sorts of stuff if I had the money because I just like it. It doesn't mean that I think it's going to be useful. I just like it, right? That's us. Everybody else does not behave that way. They're different than what we are. And so you may see a brand new technology go out, for instance, like VR, and you're like, oh, VR is just so cool. And then it just takes like 45 years to ever get anywhere. And you're like, why is this taking so long, right? That's the importance of those social theories. And again, in your personal life, well, it doesn't really matter so much. It's kind of nice to know them, but in your business life, it really, really helps to know them, because when you see that new technology come out and you go, oh, that's so cool, then you'll actually be able to go, okay, how's that going to be used here? And is it powerful enough to do it? Is it functional enough to do it right now? And you'll be able to evaluate it well. So some innovation barely does survive. I mentioned that whole thing about the GS and how they could have really dominated the market had they not thrown everything into the Macintosh computer. That was their big mistake. Should have just moved the others forward. As a matter of fact, one thing that I believe I mentioned in that I don't mention, haven't mentioned here, is that the GS actually had, because things had improved, right, over the 10 years since the Apple II, the GS had a little card inside of it. So it didn't just emulate Apple II stuff, it ran it. It was like a whole Apple II computer on this little tiny card that they had built into the system. So if you wanted to run your old Apple II stuff, boom, it would just use that card. Just pretty fantastic. All right, so another big thing, of course, that really helps propel IBM forward for a while is all the compatibles, where they reverse engineer that firmware. And I believe I described that, but that's that process of taking a person that's never written a firmware, they don't know what a firmware does, they've never used a computer, and you take that person and you had, with another individual, wrote down everything that that firmware does. Then you take that book, give it to the other person and say, I need you to design something that fills these specifications. And that's how you reverse engineer. That's how legally they got away with copying IBM, because IBM stuff was all off the shelf parts, as you watch in the video. But the thing that wasn't off the shelf was that firmware, how it interacted with those parts. And in order to be 100% compatible, you had to know what that firmware was doing and duplicate it. All right, so moving on here. Talk about how they were forced. I give you some screenshots of, hey, this is what you're dealing with in the 70s and 80s, all the way through the 80s, is this kind of graphical screen. Most people have a really hard time of even deciphering what's going on in here. I put this out there. There's a spreadsheet, and a word processor, and a database. That's what we used back then. And then we talked about the financial aspect. We even talked about the compatibility, that these were not compatible with one another. And then let me get down to, there's the Windows 95, which was quite a victory for Microsoft. It really laid things in perfectly. And Microsoft, I don't know if they knew it at the time or they just lucked out. I have no idea. Watched a lot of stuff on it, but I don't know. That compatibility thing, Microsoft did well, right? So they had MS-DOS 2.0, and if you developed a software package that ran on MS-DOS 2.0, it would still work on Windows 95. So 2.0, right? That's like 1982, 1983 for that stuff, maybe earlier. And so over 10 years later, you can still run that software. People are spending thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of dollars, of course, on software. And they just don't like to be told within 4 years that now they got to go out and buy another $400 or $600 worth of software. Microsoft made sure that if you could use it back then, you could use it now. And that meant you kept your investment and you saved money, because these computers were expensive. And the other companies did not pick up on that. They were just pushing forward on whatever. They didn't pick up on the fact that, no, we need to make sure that Lotus 123 from 6 years ago still works on our system. They weren't thinking that way. All right, so I'm going to cut that off there, and then we'll talk about this second portion, this next video. So I'll be back immediately. Oops, I don't want the meeting info. Sorry.